Video was still playing on my phone when my sister leaned over and whispered, "They literally give those out to anyone who files a complaint now, don't they?" She was talking about my Commendation medal. I was standing at the front of the room at CFB Trenton's main hall in my RCAF dress uniform, hands clasped behind my back, waiting for my name to be called. My mother sat in the third row between my brother and my sister, and the three of them looked like they'd been dragged there against their will. My mother had her arms crossed. My brother was scrolling his phone. My sister had just said what she said, quietly enough that only I could hear, but loud enough that she knew I did. I kept my eyes forward. "My name is Sergeant Yvette Marchetti. I was 31 years old that afternoon, and I had spent 6 of those years in the Royal Canadian Air Force. I had done 2 rotations overseas, one in Latvia, one in Kuwait, and I had come back from the second one with a fractured left wrist, a hearing loss in my right ear, and a commendation for actions taken during a logistics convoy incident near a forward operating base that I am still not permitted to describe in detail. I had come back, which was more than 2 people in that convoy had managed. My family didn't come to either of my deployments. They didn't come to my basic training graduation at CFSAT in Borden. They came to this ceremony only because my commanding officer, Colonel Arsenault, had called my mother personally and told her that attendance mattered. My mother respected authority when it wore enough rank on its shoulders, so they came. They sat there and they made me feel like I had done something embarrassing. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the adjoining room, coffee and butter tarts from the mess kitchen, people standing around in small groups. Colonel Arsenault shook my hand and held it a beat longer than usual. He said, "I need 5 minutes with you before you leave. My office." I assumed it was paperwork. It wasn't. His office smelled like old coffee and the particular kind of institutional carpet that only exists on military bases. He closed the door and didn't sit down, which was the first sign. Colonel Arsenault always sat down. He said, "There's something I've been authorized to share with you, and I want to do it myself rather than have it come through channels." He paused. "The convoy incident in Kuwait. The route compromise." I went very still. "We have a confirmed source," he said. "The intelligence that leaked your unit's route and timing, we've traced it. The origin point was a Canadian-registered private company with a federal logistics contract, a company based in Mississauga." I said nothing. "Your family owns a logistics firm based in Mississauga, Sergeant Marchetti." "Marchetti Freight Solutions. My father had started it 22 years ago with a second mortgage on our house in Brampton and a used flatbed truck. My brother had been running operations for the past 3 years. They had government contracts. I knew that. Everybody in my family talked about it like it was a source of enormous pride. The federal tenders they'd won, the D&D work, the supply chain contracts. I had never thought to connect any of it to anything I was doing overseas. The thought had genuinely never crossed my mind. RCMP's National Security Enforcement Team has been investigating for 7 months, Colonel Arsenault said. "I am telling you this because you have a right to know before it becomes public. And because in approximately 48 hours, there will be a search warrant executed at the Marchetti Freight Solutions offices on Dixie Road." I sat down without asking permission. He let me. I don't remember exactly what I said next. I remember asking if my father knew what had happened, if he understood that 2 of my colleagues had not come home, and Colonel Arsenault said that was a question for the investigators, not for him. I remember asking if I was under any suspicion, and he said no, unequivocally no, which was the one thing in that conversation that didn't feel like the floor dropping out from under me. I drove back to my parents' house in Brampton that night. I don't entirely know why. Some part of me needed to see their faces. Some part of me needed to be in the same room as them and know whether they knew what was coming. My mother was in the kitchen making pasta. My father was watching the Leafs game. My brother had already left. My sister was sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of wine, still in the blouse she'd worn to the ceremony. Nobody congratulated me. My father glanced up when I came in and said, "You staying for dinner?" Not hello, not well done, not I'm glad you came home. I sat at the table and watched my mother move around the kitchen, and I tried to find something in her face, guilt, worry, anything, and found nothing. She looked exactly like she always looked. She looked fine. My sister refilled her glass and said, without looking at me, Dad says there's a problem with one of the federal tenders, some audit thing. My father said, it's nothing. I said, what kind of audit? He said, Yvette, it's nothing. Government paperwork, you wouldn't understand. I had spent 6 years processing classified logistics documentation for the Royal Canadian Air Force. I probably understood more about federal tendering and contract compliance than anyone in that room. I didn't say that. I sat there, ate my mother's pasta, and said almost nothing for an hour, and then I drove back to my apartment in Belleville, and I sat on the edge of my bed and I didn't sleep. The warrant was executed on a Thursday morning. I found out through my sister, who called me at 7:15 a.m. in a state of barely controlled panic. There are police at Dad's office, she said. Like, a lot of police. Yvette, what is happening? I said I didn't know. That was a lie. What I did know, and what I spent the following 3 weeks learning in pieces, was this. Marchetti Freight Solutions had held a federal subcontract with a defense logistics firm that processed supply chain manifests for Canadian Forces deployments in the Gulf region. My brother, as operations director, had access to routing databases that were not classified but that contained scheduling and logistical data that could, if someone knew what they were looking at, be used to infer troop movements and convoy timings. Someone had sold that data. The RCMP's investigation determined that my brother had transmitted data extracts to a third-party contact on 4 separate occasions over an 18-month period. The amounts received were not large. The largest single payment was $11,000, deposited through a numbered company registered in Alberta. $11,000. That was the going rate for the kind of information that had gotten 2 people I knew killed and left me with a partially reconstructed wrist and a permanent ringing in my right ear. My father hadn't known. That was the one finding that surprised me, and then didn't. My father was not a man who involved himself in operational details. He'd built the company and handed it to my brother to run, the way he had always assumed he would, because my brother was his son and his successor and his legacy, and what his son did with the thing he'd built was not something he monitored closely. The investigators found no evidence that my father had known. They also found evidence that he had signed off on several of the contracts that gave my brother the access in the first place, without reading them carefully enough to understand what access he was granting. In Canadian law, that created a complicated situation. My father was not charged with anything related to the data sale. He was charged with breach of federal contract compliance obligations, a civil matter, not criminal. The company lost all its federal contracts immediately and permanently. The fine was substantial enough that the company could not absorb it and continue operating. Marchetti Freight Solutions, 22 years old, was placed into receivership in the spring. My brother was charged under the Security of Information Act. He pled not guilty and then, after 8 months, and what I was told were extensive negotiations, changed his plea. He received a federal sentence of 9 years. He is currently at Joyceville Institution. My mother never forgave me. That is the part that still sits in my chest like a stone, because I didn't do anything. I didn't report them. I didn't call the RCMP. I didn't send an anonymous tip or speak to a journalist or do anything except drive back to Belleville and not sleep. The investigation had been running for 7 months before I knew anything about it. Colonel Arsenault told me as a courtesy, my family's consequences were entirely the result of things my family had done. But my mother needed somewhere to put it, and she put it on me. She called me the week after my brother's sentencing and said, "You could have warned us." I said I'd found out 48 hours before the search warrant, same as them. She said, "You knew people in authority. You had ways to find things out. You chose not to." I said that wasn't true, and also that even if it were, warning them would have meant obstructing a federal investigation. She said, "He's your brother." I said, "He sold information that killed people I served with." She hung up. My sister took my mother's side. She always has. My sister has a particular talent for identifying which way a conflict is going to harden and positioning herself accordingly, and she positioned herself on the side of the family against me, which was the same position she'd always been in, really. The ceremony, the whispered comment, the wine at the kitchen island. None of that was new. I had just stopped pretending it didn't matter. My father didn't call. He has not called. I don't know if that is guilt or grief or simply that he doesn't know what to say, and after enough time without a call, the reason stops mattering. I had a therapist at the time, an RCAF contracted counselor at the base in Trenton named Dr. Bhattacharya, who I had been seeing since I came back from Kuwait. She said something to me once that I have thought about many times since. She said, there is a version of this where you spend years trying to figure out whether you owe them something. Loyalty, silence, forgiveness, something. And there is another version where you accept that what happened, and you start from there. I tried to figure out which version I was in for a long time. What I did, practically speaking, was this. I finished my current service contract. I applied for a position with Transport Canada's Security and Intelligence Branch, which works in coordination with both the RCMP and the CBSA on federal transportation security issues. I got the position. I moved to Ottawa. The Marquette Freight Solutions building on Dixie Road, the one my father had leased for 16 years. The one with the sign he was so proud of, the Marquette name in large green letters above the loading dock, was sold during the receivership proceedings. I did not buy it. I have no interest in owning a logistics warehouse in Mississauga, but I drove past it once, about a year after the receivership, and someone had already repainted the sign. The name was gone. I thought about my father seeing that. I thought about how much of himself he had put into that name and what it must feel like to have it painted over, and I let myself feel sorry for him. For that specific thing, the loss of the name, the loss of what he thought he'd built, before I kept driving. There are things I know now that I didn't know when I was standing in that hall at CFB Trenton, waiting to receive a medal while my family sat in the third row and made small cutting comments to each other. I know that the people who are supposed to be proud of you are not always the people who will be. I know that doing the right thing, even when you had no choice, even when you didn't technically do anything at all, can cost you things you didn't expect to lose. I know that two people I served with have families who got a different call than I did, and that my losses are not comparable to theirs, and that I hold that knowledge carefully. I know that the Commendation medal is in a box in my closet in Ottawa, and I haven't decided yet what to do with it. Some days I think I'll put it on the wall. Some days that feels like too much. Most days I get up and go to work and do the job, and that is enough. For now, that is enough. I keep coming back to one image, my mother in her kitchen, moving around the stove like nothing had happened, the night before everything collapsed. She looked completely fine. That's the part I couldn't make sense of for a long time. Not the betrayal itself, but how ordinary the evening felt. Pasta on the stove, the Leafs game in the other room, my father asking if I was staying for dinner. What I've come to understand is that the consequences my family faced weren't something that happened to them out of nowhere. They were the result of choices that had been building quietly for years. The choice to treat a government contract as a personal resource, the choice to look away when looking away was convenient, the choice to show up to my ceremony and make small cutting comments instead of just staying home. Actions accumulate. That's not a religious idea, it's just arithmetic. Eventually, the sum becomes visible. My brother made a calculation that certain information had a price and that the risk of selling it was acceptable. He was wrong about the risk and wrong about something more fundamental, that there is no version of that transaction that doesn't have a human cost on the other end. Two people I served with didn't come home. He weighed their lives against $11,000 and didn't stop himself. That failure wasn't just a failure of judgment, it was a failure of conscience, the kind that doesn't happen suddenly. It happens gradually, in small decisions that quietly erode the line between what a person will and won't do. I've thought a lot about what made it possible for me to sit in Colonel Arsenault's office that afternoon and absorb what he told me without falling apart. I don't think it was strength exactly. I think it was clarity. The kind that comes from having spent years in a role where the consequences of decisions are immediate and real, where you can't afford to be vague about your responsibilities. The military gave me that. It gave me a framework for thinking about what I owe other people, and it gave me enough practice operating under pressure that when the pressure arrived in a form I hadn't expected, I didn't collapse into it. What I had to build on my own was the steadiness to keep going afterward. The months after the investigation were not easy. I was doing my job. I was seeing Dr. Bhattacharya. I was making practical decisions about my future, and underneath all of that I was grieving something I didn't have a clean word for. Not my family exactly. More like the version of my family I had kept believing in long past the point where the evidence supported it. Yvette didn't warn them. Yvette didn't obstruct anything. Yvette just kept doing the job she had committed to doing and let the consequences fall where they fell. I tell that story to myself sometimes in the third person when I need a little distance from it. It helps. What I want anyone watching this to take from it is not that loyalty is worthless. It's that loyalty without honesty is just complicity wearing a warmer coat. The people who truly care about you don't ask you to be smaller or quieter or more accommodating of things that are wrong. They want you intact. They want you to be the version of yourself that can look back on what you did and feel steady about it. I'm working toward that steadiness. Most days I think I'm getting there.